My story actually is about fear. So I've got a question for you. What do you think people are most afraid of? Speaking. Now you looked at my notes. Who said that? Speaking. Okay. 40% of all people are afraid of speaking in public. Now that has never been my fear. What do you think number 2 is?
Being shot at.
Being shot at. You know, that would make me pretty afraid if somebody had a gun facing me. No, what's another possibility? Number 2. What? Dying. Well, that's a good one, but that's not number 2. I'm going to tell you number 2. Number 2 is high places. People are, 32% of all people are afraid of heights. Now, I have a little bit of that. The other day at the testimony workshop, there was a man cleaning the windows behind whoever was speaking, and I was watching him with a cigarette in his mouth on this platform cleaning a window, and I just had some fear at that moment for him, and I thought I could never do that kind of thing. But to get to know me a little bit better, today I'm going to share with you my 3 greatest fears. My first 2, snakes. Yeah, I heard a groan in the back. And horses. Then I hear this, horses? You know, I'm not going to tell you the snake story. Just know there's a good reason why I'm afraid of snakes, especially rattlesnakes. I don't like them. Horses. Why am I afraid of horses? Well, my grandmother used to always come up to me and say, "You're not riding horses, are you?" I said, no ma'am, I'm not riding horses. And she would ask that periodically, and so I knew that it wasn't probably a good thing that I would ride horses. So I became very fearful of horses. Now you wonder why my grandmother would ask me a crazy question like that, you know, out of the blue. Well, there was a reason for it. She didn't want to happen to me what happened to my dad. My dad was a physician. He had come to San Antonio, Texas by way of the military. He was from Chicago, and he got down there in the Air Force and did some hyperbaric chamber research for the Air Force, and ended up retiring in San Antonio and establishing a private practice. Now, one of the things my dad really enjoyed doing was playing polo, competitive polo. So every Sunday afternoon, my dad and his polo cronies would compete against some of the finest polo players in the entire world every Sunday afternoon. Now, my mother, she was a newlywed with him, and my mother would go down to the polo fields every Sunday afternoon, as would my grandmother and some of the other family members, including my half-sister, and they would watch these polo matches. It was just like you would think, you know, they'd go with their hats and their fancy dress and just really enjoy the competition. But one day something went horribly wrong at the polo fields. My dad was on his pony, he clutched his chest, he fell off his horse. Of course, they called emergency medical personnel, and my mother jumped into the ambulance, and they raced him to the hospital. But my dad did not make it to the hospital. He died of a massive heart attack at the age of 39. 2 months later, I was born. I was born into a world of dysfunction. My mother was shell-shocked, as you might imagine. She never recovered from that sudden death of my dad. He was her Prince Charming. You know, when you lose somebody like that and you're pregnant, it's a very difficult thing. And so my mom began to anesthetize her pain with alcohol and prescription meds. She was on 3 different prescription meds for her depression, and later they found out that those were really brain damaging, and so I believe that's what happened to her. And so my half-sister, I tried to have a relationship with her many years later, and I called her up. She was whisked off to Pennsylvania to live with her mother and her stepfather. And I called her up. I was in New York, and I said, "Hey, Pennsylvania is very close. I'd love to have a relationship with you, Lori." And she said, "I cannot do that. It took years of counseling to overcome the events of that day. I cannot share memories of my father with you." And my half-sister knew something happened to her. I don't know, I had a feeling. 2012, she died as well at the age of 68, and this dream of having a sister relationship with her died as well. But my mom, off and on, we would live with my grandparents. I was really thankful we had a place to go when Mom couldn't make it, but when we did live together in my dad's house that he had bought, life was very much like the movie Groundhog Day. You remember that movie? You know, Bill Murray played a weatherman, and every day he'd wake up, it was the same day over and over again. And for me, it was the same day over and over again. My mom would sit in this chair, and she would just look at me with this blank stare, and she'd smoke her cigarette, and she'd drink her tea. The liquor store used to deliver in those days, and Don's and Ben's liquor store would deliver a quart of vodka and 7-Up mixer, and she'd proceed to anesthetize her pain that way. So now I'm going to share with you my third greatest fear. My third greatest fear was being anything like my mother. And it was a fear that drove me throughout my adult years. And so by the age of 13, I was really lost, and I began to go down a somewhat similar path. I began to drink in high school at the age of 13, and I began to notice boys, which is a deadly combination, drinking and noticing boys. But then a friend of mine named Leslie interceded. God used her. He planted her right in front of me in English class. And we had 5 minutes left in a class one day. The teacher said, y'all could just talk. She turned around and she said to me, Lisa, would you like to pray a prayer to receive Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? And I thought, what do I have to lose? You know, my life was not getting any better. The home was depressed, and what did I have to lose? I might as well see if this will work and this will give me a better life. And so that day I believed the verse, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life. So I prayed that day to receive Jesus. And Leslie didn't stop at that point, at that prayer. Every Sunday afternoon, she would pick me up. By the time I got into high school, we were living in a one-bedroom apartment. And every Sunday morning, she would pick me up and she would take me to church. And I'd spend all day with her family. And her mother was a Bible study teacher, and she was so godly, and her name was Glinda. And I would sit at Glinda's feet all afternoon, and I would ask her, so curious about the faith, I would ask her millions of questions. Many years later, I had an opportunity to thank her for being so patient. She says, you were no problem. Leslie was off, with a boyfriend, or she's up in her room playing records, playing Donny Osmond and the Partridge Family records, and I was down there just picking her mom's brain. But seeing this normal family, her mom and her dad, made my situation look all the worse. Sometimes you don't really understand the kind of dysfunction and difficult environment you're in until you see a normal environment. And so by the time it was time to go to college, I was ready. There was no looking back. My mom was my greatest fear, and I was going to make something of myself. I was not going to be like her. I was not going to sit in a chair all day long. I was not going to anesthetize myself. So I went to college, and about junior year, or sophomore year, I would play basketball in college just like Dave Terry. Wasn't as good. But I played basketball. And my sophomore year at a homecoming breakfast, a guy named Vern Lundquist came to speak. Do you remember Vern Lundquist?
Oh, yeah.
Vern Lundquist was a graduate of my college, Texas Lutheran. And he was a theology major. I bet you didn't know that. So Vern came, and he spoke to our sports breakfast. And I don't even remember a word Vern said, but I just knew that is what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a sportscaster. And that was back when women were not sportscasters. The only women I knew of who were sportscasters were Miss Americas. Phyllis George and Jane Kennedy were on the air at that time. And so I thought, I'm going to do this. And so many people tried to talk me out of this crazy career. Said, are you sure, Lisa? Are you sure you want to do this? And I thought, it's time for a woman who understands sports. I lived and breathed sports. I used to watch sports on TV as a child, and golf, Jack Nicklaus, he was my hero, and I watched the Knicks. Little did I know I'd be on the Knicks broadcast one day. I was a big Knicks fan when I was a kid. And so I said, no, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go after it. And sure enough, after my undergraduate school, I went up to North Texas, and I went and was a grad assistant for their radio, TV, film program, and then I landed an internship at Channel 8 in Dallas with, at that time, Vern Lundquist. So I got a big break. And George Reba was there, if you remember George Reba. And George Reba really gave me a break because he let me report. He needed somebody to help him on the weekends. So I would go out and do these reports, so I got a resume taped together. So then I had my first job in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I was there, if you know Tennessee very well. I was there for about 3 years or so. And then I got a call from a station in San Antonio, my hometown, to come back to San Antonio. And so you may be wondering, why in the world would I go to San Antonio and work where my mother was, right? Well, I didn't have much to do with my mom. I went back, I covered the Spurs, covered high school football was king, and I was at every high school football game that you can imagine, did a high school football show. But I think I went back to San Antonio because I was meant to marry my husband, meet my husband Jeff, who's back there in the green shirt. Because 6 months, he worked literally around the corner, and he worked with one of my friends from high school. And I was complaining about all the guys I was dating, that I just didn't like them, and she goes, well, there's a guy at work who's a big sports fan that you might like, and in fact, Jeff's friends called him the unmarriable because he was so into sports, and so it was a perfect match, and we ended up getting married, and I think that's why God brought me back to San Antonio. But my dream was to be an ESPN Sports Center anchor. That was my dream. ESPN was new in those days, and I thought, wouldn't it be cool to work for a network that all they did was sports? I mean, and when I was working in a news station, I'd go up and say, I need a photographer for a sports story, and they'd put me off like, well, we don't have anybody. We've got this news story going on over here, and you might have to wait. We'll see if we can get that for you, Lisa. But being a member of a sports network, wow. I mean, that would be the priority. And so this is what I wanted. So I hired a New York City agent to help me reach this goal. And about 5 years into my time at San Antonio at the CBS affiliate, I get this call from my agent. He said, Lisa, we have an opportunity for you. HBO Sports, the show inside the NFL, wants to interview you to be a correspondent for the program. And I said, that is so exciting. I would love to do that, but there's only one problem. I'm like 7.5 months pregnant, and I'm not sure they're going to be able to look past this big belly of mine to do this job. And he goes, let's try it. Let's go ahead and try it. So the last week that I could actually travel pregnant, I went to New York City. And I remember learning a very important lesson. Don't take your shoes off when you're on a plane and you're pregnant. Don't do it. Yeah, I couldn't get them back on. They were so swollen. And so that was a lesson learned. But so I really prepped for this interview. I ended up interviewing a guy named Marty Glickman, who was the voice of the Jets, and he was the voice of the Giants at times, and he was also a member of one of the Olympic teams, and he was Jewish, and he didn't get to compete in the Olympics that he was a part of as a runner because it was during the Hitler time, and so they didn't allow him to compete. So he had a very fascinating story. And so I prepared for this interview with him. I did pretty well. I had favor with him, favor with the executive producer. His wife had just had twins, so he knew that this would go down a bit before football season. And they hired me. So I traveled all over the country covering NFL teams, NFL stories, interesting human interest features. And then a year later, I was doing this from San Antonio, still working in San Antonio. A year later, I had another opportunity. The Madison Square Garden network that carried the Knicks, the Rangers, and the Yankees games asked me to come up and anchor their sports desk, which is a mini version of Sports Center, regional Sports Center. And so I asked Jeff, what do you think? So he said, I'll go. And so Jeff, yes, well, after some, arm bending, but no, he really was very sweet. And not many men would do that. And he decided to go with me up to New York City. We went to New York with a 8-month-old child, a nanny, and 2 dogs. And so I'll never forget when we went to our rental house in New Rochelle, New York. The moving guy looked at me and he said, "Ma'am, can I ask you a personal question?" I said, "Sure, go ahead, shoot." He goes, "Why did you do this?" And because he saw the house we came out of in San Antonio and the Archie Bunker house that we went to. And I looked at him and I said, "For the adventure, of course. This is an adventure." So here we are in New York City, and I love New York. I loved it. And let me just tell you about my day. New Rochelle. a cab, because there were no parking spaces at the train station, so a cab had to pick me up. They would take me to the New Rochelle station. I would take a Metro North Railroad train all the way down to Grand Central Station. I would get out at Grand Central, then I would go to the subway, and then I'd take a subway to Times Square, and then I'd have to catch a different train down to Penn Station. Then I would walk through Penn Station and walk up the stairs and up the ramps at Penn Station. Sometimes the Barnum and Bailey Circus would be there at Penn Station, and they would be bathing an elephant on the ramp as I went up to my office. Life was a circus, and this Texas girl loved it. I loved New York. I loved the atmosphere. I loved the restaurants. I loved the shows. I loved the shopping. I loved it. And I loved the sports. It was fun to be on the Knicks broadcasts, the team that I followed as a child, and the Yankees. One time Jeff was there at the Yankee Stadium with my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, and my name flashed up on the screen. So that is kind of where I was. But then after a few years of doing that, the bottom dropped out of my life. In 1 week's time, I wasn't renewed on my contract with MSG. And I also wasn't renewed on my contract with Inside the NFL after 3 seasons. Inside the NFL was the toughest one for me because they said, hey, we weren't looking to replace you. but Andrea Joyce, who was a bigger name than me, wants to do it. I'm sorry, Lisa, you know the kind of work you did. And so that was a hard job to lose like that. That's television. And so I felt lost. I had lost my identity. I didn't know if I'd ever work in television again. And I blamed God. I hadn't been following him for 17 years. Once I went to college, I kind of fell away. For 17 years, I had not been connected. But I blamed him. I don't know, we all do that, don't we? Why would you take my livelihood away from me? Why would you take my job away from me? I was like, my husband said, we got to move. And I said, no, I like New Rochelle. I like the commute to New York City. I like being close. I like the city. I was like Ava Gabor. Remember Ava Gabor in Green Acres? New York is where I'd rather stay. I get allergic smelling hay. I just adore a penthouse view. Darling, I love you. Just give me Park Avenue. And that was me. That was me. I went kicking and screaming to Connecticut because we thought, well, maybe if I get closer to ESPN, I might be able to hook on there. So in the meantime, I was lost, as I said, and so I went back to that foundation that was established for me in high school, my Christian foundation. I found a church, did one of these back when we had yellow pages, landed on one, but that was where God wanted me. Because we walked into this little church in Fairfield, Connecticut, and this woman put her arm around us, and she said, oh, we are so glad that you are here. And honey, there's a mom's Bible study that I would really love for you to join, and I want to introduce you to some of these young moms, and I think you would like them, and so look, come over here. And so I thought, well, yeah, I got nothing but time right now. I could do a Bible study. And so I joined this Bible study, and we were studying the book of John. And I thought later, isn't it just like God to reach out to me and pull his prodigal daughter back in through the love gospel, out of his love? So it was during that time I began to read the Word of God for the first time. I began to pray for the first time. And I began to just to listen for God's voice. And it was during that time that he answered my venomous questions. Why would you take this job away from me? Why would you take my livelihood away from me? And I heard as clear as day, Lisa, I gave you a national platform to glorify me and you didn't do it. I had to take it away from you to get your attention. And it was during that time I just dropped to my knees and I got teary and I said, Lord, if you give me another chance as a sportscaster, not only will I give you my career, I'll give you my life. See, there's a difference between making Jesus your Savior and making him your Lord. I had not given him lordship. And that day in my kitchen, I gave him lordship. He became the Lord of my life. I gave him total control. So I began to see the fruit then. I began to see changes. My desires were starting to become his desires. And guess what? 1 week later, after I gave him lordship, I got a call from my agent. How would you like to do some freelance reporting for ESPN? Now, being a new rededicated believer, I should have prayed over that. But I thought, well, this is an answer to prayer, right? And so I immediately said, I can do that. And so, sure enough, I began traveling for ESPN and traveling to different stories. And one day I remember there was a story that conflicted with my Bible study that I was in. And so this is the new Lisa. I'm like, gosh, Bible study, story about the Celtics, Bible study. And so I finally decided, well, I guess I should do this story. And I got somebody to take the muffins that day. I was in charge. And so I was on my way to Boston. And I drove, as I remember, because it wasn't that far. So I drove to Boston, and I was playing this Rod Stewart song, Have I Told You Lately? It was a tape. Do you remember that song? And so I played that song, I began to think, this is really spiritual. Have I told you lately that I love you? Have I told you there's no one else above you? Fill my heart with gladness, take away all my sadness, ease my troubles. That's what you do. And I began to sing that song to the Lord over and over and over at the top of my lungs. A song of love and thanksgiving to God for saving me and bringing me back into his fold. And that song, it was a little eerie, but from then on, that song played everywhere I went. It played in the drugstore, it played in the grocery store, it played at the restaurant. And I realized that God was singing it back to me. He had heard me. So I did ESPN for about 6 months when I got a job offer, another job offer, to go back to the CBS affiliate in San Antonio where I'd come from. The news director had heard that I'd lost my jobs, and so he wanted to see if I'd come back and just take the same position. I was Noon and 6 sportscaster by the time I left, and he wanted to see if I would come back and take the job. Now, the old Lisa would have never done that. The old Lisa would not take a step backwards. The old Lisa would have worked her way up the ladder as a reporter. I would have filled in on the overnight shift or whatever I had to do in order to get a sports center position. But the new Lisa said, what do you want me to do? So what came to me is if they offered me sports center, I'd stay. That'd be my sign to stay. If they didn't offer me sports center, that would be my sign to go. And so I told them about the job offer, and they took about a week to decide, and then they brought me into the office. They said, Lisa, we cannot offer you a sports center anchoring job, but we can offer you a full-time reporting job with ESPN. And I think I'm the first person to ever turn down a full-time reporting job with ESPN because I knew that was my sign. I was supposed to go back to San Antonio. So we packed up the house. We went back to our same old house in San Antonio that we'd rented out while we were gone. And do you think this return to San Antonio was about following the Cowboys to the Super Bowl, which I did? I was at every Cowboys game, home and away. No. Was this about following the Spurs to the playoffs that year? Was this about going to the Winter Olympics in Lillehammer, Norway? And they advertised this, Lisa in Lillehammer. And no. God brought me to San Antonio to honor my mother for the first time. By that time, my mom was in a group home. She was not able to maintain her medications, and she'd go off her meds, and crazy things would happen, and they had to call the police and all that kind of stuff. But honoring my mom meant going to see her on a regular basis and taking her grandson to see her. And honoring my mom meant taking her money and providing for her needs. Honoring my mom meant forgiving her. I was still in Bible study. I didn't ever stop Bible study. I started doing a Bible study that was on the book of Romans. And it was through that study of Romans that I realized how much God had forgiven me for. I had gone kind of off, as I said, I went away from the Lord. And in college, I was drinking heavily and partying, and I was promiscuous because, fatherless girls are always trying to find the love of God, or love of Father in boys, and until you find the love of God as Father. And so I realized that God had given me such grace and had forgiven me for all of that. who was I not to forgive my mother? So I forgave my mother, and I began to understand my mother. I began to see her through God's eyes. What would I have done if I had watched my husband drop dead in front of my very eyes? How would I have reacted? And I had a love for my mother. I began to love her unconditionally. Because what does the Bible say about love? It doesn't say love only those who treat you well. No. It says love your enemies. And that's not as easy to do, is it? But God began to give me a love for her. It was so much love that I wanted to take care of her needs. I had a joy in taking care of her needs and getting her clothes or whatever it was she needed. And one day she calls me up and she said, Lisa, I need a pair of shoes. And I said, Mom, I was still in television at that time, and I said, as soon as I get a break, I'm going to go buy you those shoes. And so I ran to the store during lunch, and I found her a pair of shoes that I thought she'd like. They'd be comfortable. Her feet were kind of troubled. And so I felt this urgency to get her shoes. And what I didn't realize at the time is that time was short. God was telling me that time was short. Because before I could get her those shoes, I had a call from her caregiver who said, your mom has had a massive heart attack. She's in the hospital. She's in a coma. They don't expect her to make it. So the last week of my mother's life, I was by her bedside at the hospital. I was stroking her hair, and I was telling her how much I dearly loved her. And when she did die, I made sure she had those shoes on her feet. You see, it wasn't until I forgave my mom, until I began to love her unconditionally, as God calls us to love unconditionally, that he could use me in any form of ministry. It wasn't until I did that. When she died, her caregiver gave me this shoebox. And she goes, here's your mom's stuff. Her entire life fit into a shoebox. And it was at that moment I had my calling. I wanted to help women have a more abundant life than what fits into a shoebox. And that's where my ministry, aside from Roaring Lamb's Pearls of Promise, was begun. Because as a pearl, you know how a pearl's formed. It's formed by irritation in an oyster shell. Sometimes this irritation can go on 10, 12 years, long years, year after year after year. But what comes out? Something beautiful, a beautiful gem, a beautiful pearl. And I believe that God can make beautiful pearls out of all of us, out of all the dysfunction, out of all the trials, out of all the disappointments in our lives. And I want to help women do that. I want them to have more life than what fits into a shoebox. And you know what? God began to heal me. Sometimes we have to get to this point before he can heal us. And so as evidence of that, I went to my first polo match in 2015. I'd never covered polo. The only thing I'd ever done with polo is that I'd interviewed one of the world's greatest polo players that ever lived. That's what he was described as. His name was Cecil Smith. And I went up to Cecil Smith, who was being inducted into the San Antonio Sports Hall of Fame. And after I talked to him about all his life, I said, hey, I just thought I'd ask you a question while I got you here. Did you know my dad, Dr. Bill Burkhardt? And he goes, I was there the day he took his fall. So he was at the polo fields that day. So I started to ask him some questions, and he just changed the subject. He wanted to talk about the TV station. And I thought maybe that day affected him as well, as a polo player. But I went to this polo match, and I thought, Jeff goes to my sister-in-law who arranged this in Sarasota, Florida. He goes, are you sure we should do a polo match? Remember, Lisa's dad died on a polo field. Maybe this is not such a great idea. And so we went to the polo match. I did it, and I was worried, but guess what? It was a polo match. It was so exciting to watch how they scored goals and the movement on the horses, and I realized I was healed from that. It was a polo match and very enjoyable. Then in 2014, I went to Israel for the first time. How many have been to Israel? And it was there that I rode a horse-like animal, a camel named Kojak, on the Mount of Olives. the trainer comes up to me and he goes, and I had no intention to ride this camel because, I'm afraid of horses, and camels are even taller than horses. And so the handler comes up to me and goes, come on, mama, ride the camel, mama, and show your friends back home. We'll take a picture. I said, no, I don't think so. Let somebody else ride the camel. Oh, come on, mama, you can ride the camel. He'll be fine. He's very tame. Come on, mama, ride the camel. And I thought, what better place to overcome one of my greatest fears than on the Mount of Olives where Jesus ascended and where Jesus will come back again. So that day, fortunately, the camel crouches down, unlike a horse. And so I got on that camel, and I sat up straight to take the picture. But he didn't stop there. He goes, come on, mama. Raise your hands in the air, mama. Let go of the reins, mama. And I'll take a picture, and you'll show your friends back home. Okay. So I raised my hands up in the air, both of them. I was so worried that camel was going to take off and go over the cliff into the Kidron Valley. But no, I raised my hands up in the air. He snapped that photo. I wish I had a picture of it here to show you. And that day, I overcame one of my greatest fears. He can help you overcome your fears. I don't know what you're afraid of. But God says in his word, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. He says, do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. If you're fearful of something, I don't know what it is, fearful. Maybe you're fearful of dying. Maybe you're fearful that somebody you love is going to pass away. Maybe you're fearful of I knew a woman who was afraid to go to the grocery store. I don't know what you're afraid of, but God can help you overcome your fears. There is no fear in his love. Maybe there's somebody, maybe from this message you realize there's someone you still hold a grudge against that you haven't forgiven. Forgiveness is non-negotiable in God's economy. Matthew 6:14-15 says, for if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their sins, your Father will not forgive your sins. Then in Ephesians 4 it says, get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. He calls us to forgive. We have to forgive. So it wasn't until I forgave, as I said to you, that God could use me. And now I have this ministry, Pearls of Promise. Now I help Roaring Lambs. I love Roaring Lambs, and I love the testimony workshops because I see so much healing that goes on when people literally come forward with their stories. And that is important to me. I think that's why I like it so much. And I love the books because, again, it's stories of overcoming. I love the radio show that Donna and myself put together. We have people like Dave Terry on who tell their stories. And we're hoping that people are listening to their stories and hearing these wonderful accounts of overcoming. Why? Because they had an encounter with Jesus Christ, just as I had in my kitchen in Stratford, Connecticut. Changed my life forever. And people need to hear about it. God is a forgiver. He's a lover. And he helps us to overcome our fears. Which of these do you need to overcome today? I'd like to pray with you.